I'm taking the old hag's house. Get out. Paul laughed triumphantly after saying that. Behind him, his lover, Emma, also smirked. Had they been betraying us for years? If you understand, then pack your things and leave quickly. I looked towards Scott, worried that he might be shocked to see his father like this. Instead, Scott burst out laughing. They probably didn't expect him to laugh. Paul and Emma were stunned, their eyes wide. Meanwhile, I couldn't help but burst into laughter, carried away by Scott's laughter. Scott, don't make me laugh. Sorry. As Scott and I spoke, Paul's face showed anger, thinking we were mocking him. Are you making fun of us? Oh, have you gone crazy because you're suddenly being kicked out? Dad, don't you know? Then, Scott began to reveal a certain truth. I am Gina Manning, a 42-year-old working mother. Living with me are my mother and my husband, Paul, along with our son, Scott. My father passed away in a traffic accident when I was young. I'll protect you, Gina. You don't have to worry about anything. Since then, my mother has raised me by herself. It must have been tough for her after losing my father. Both sets of grandparents had already passed away, leaving us with no one to rely on. Despite her busy work schedule, she doted on me. I grew up without much hardship and am deeply grateful to my mother. What? My mother. When I started working, perhaps due to overexertion, my mother collapsed at work and had to be hospitalized. It's nothing serious. I'm okay. She said this with a smile as I rushed to her side, but it couldn't alleviate my worries. When I consulted Paul, who I was dating at the time, he suggested, then, let's move in together. What? But first, we should get married. If we live together, it might make you feel a bit more secure. Paul's words were truly comforting. The prognosis was that she could be discharged soon. But it was uncertain when she might collapse again. Thus, I wanted to have a wedding while my mother was still healthy. And to live together for peace of mind. But, is that okay? It's fine. I often have to travel for work anyway. And your mother being there will give me peace of mind too. We confirmed it multiple times, and soon after my mother was discharged, we got married and moved into my childhood home. It looks like I'm pregnant. Really? Thank you, Gina. This time, I'll support you. Soon after, I became pregnant with Scott. With my mother's support, I was able to give birth to Scott and raise him in the best environment. I am deeply grateful to my family for this. Oh, Scott. I'm heading home now. Where are you? Just finished club activities, getting ready to head home. Then wait for me at school, I'll stop by on my way. One day after work, as I was able to leave on time, I contacted Scott, who was also about to head home. Since it was raining, I decided to pick him up from his bicycle commute. Scott also replied, honestly, I appreciate it. I got into the car and headed to his school. Sorry to keep you waiting, Scott. Oh. As I approached the school gate by car, I saw Scott talking to a girl under the shelter. I recognized the girl, and I couldn't help but stare intently. Why are you staring so intently? Just so you know, she's not my girlfriend. Oh? Really? She's just a junior from my club activities. The girl's name was Candace Hansen. She was indeed just a junior from his club activities, and she was waiting for her ride to arrive as well. Remember I told you about my best friend? She's his girlfriend, and he asked me to wait with her because he's worried. I'm sorry for bothering you, senior. You can leave first if you need to. The surname Hansen and her refined demeanor somehow felt familiar. Then, from behind, a voice called out, "Hey, is that Gina?" It was. Emma Hansen, a former junior of mine. Emma? Is that you? Yes, it's me. Long time no see. She still had the habit of unnecessarily extending her speech. As I recalled our school days, I felt a mix of nostalgia and mild exasperation. Gina, don't you have a boyfriend? I'm not interested in that. Emma, with her demure appearance and name, was well known for her deceptive act of feigning innocence to get close and steal other men. In fact, I have comforted a friend who cried over losing her boyfriend to Emma. Because of this, I always kept my distance and treated her coldly. Emma seemed displeased with this and often tried to provoke me. What a surprise to see you here, Gina. Mom, it's embarrassing. Please stop bothering his parents. Emma approached me with the same smile she always used. But this time, it was her daughter, Candace, who stopped her. Candace then gestured to me, signaling it was time to leave. Scott, let's go home. Excuse us then. Grateful to Candace, I called out to Scott, and we quickly left. Scott seemed to understand our thoughts and promptly got into the car. Is that woman a friend of yours? Well, yes, sort of a junior from back in the day. Hearing my response, Scott glanced through the window at Emma and her daughter. I don't like her. I nodded in agreement. I had interacted with her because she was a senior and because it was the mature thing to do. But I hoped to never meet her again. However, a bad feeling lingered, leaving me uneasy. What kind of girl is Candace? Just a regular junior. She's really close to my best friend though. But? Scott looked uncomfortable, but after a moment he said. My best friend says she kind of reminds him of me. Says our eyes look very similar. Remembering Candace's eyes, I could see the resemblance to Scott. Well, I think it's just a coincidence. His words followed, and while I agreed, it only intensified the uneasy feeling I had. Mom, can I talk to you for a bit? What's the matter? One day, while Scott was at club activities and Paul was on a business trip, it was just my mother and me at home. I decided to tell her about my encounter with Emma. Emma, the one who was rumored about, right? My mother was aware of Emma's reputation. In fact, it was hard to find someone in town who wasn't. Is she married? I shook my head. I had never heard about Emma marrying. And the idea that she had a daughter was completely new to me. It was natural not to hear anything since everyone distanced themselves from her after high school. I have a bad feeling about this. I feel the same. The fact that Emma's daughter was at the same school as Scott. I sighed without thinking. I want to discuss this with Paul too, but he's been so busy lately. Indeed, Paul has been very busy lately. My mother responded thoughtfully. Paul was always either on business trips or working overtime. His department naturally required frequent travel. Well, he's the future president of the company. He has to work hard. Paul worked for the company owned by my father-in-law, who, along with everyone else, expected him to be the next president. He was working hard to meet these expectations. Still, it feels a little lonely. It had become normal for him not to be at home. He tried to be home for Scott's and my birthdays and to attend school events like sports days. But I never thought he would be away from home this much. My mother murmured, and I couldn't help but give a wry smile. When I struggled with Scott's upbringing or when I was sick, Paul was never home. It was always my mother who had retired from her job who helped me. I wanted to reduce the burden on my mother, but I am still a burden on her. It's not a burden, but I do worry about what will happen if I'm gone. Indeed, living with Scott and occasionally Paul felt normal to me. What will happen to this house, living with Scott and Paul, if you're not here? Honestly, I'm worried. But I couldn't let my worries burden my mother. It's okay. We're family, I replied with a smile. Though my mother looked at me with a complex expression. Oh, Paul. Are you free right now?
Yeah.
I'm free. What's up with the sudden call? That day, feeling anxious from the conversation with my mother, I decided to call Paul. His gentle voice over the phone was a relief. I'm a bit concerned about something. Do you remember Emma? Huh? His voice halted at my words, making me tilt my head. Remember? I told you about a troublesome junior from my student days. Oh, right, I remember now. Sorry, it took me a moment. What about Emma? Although I was curious about his strange reaction, I told him about meeting her and that her daughter was at the same school as Scott. Really? Candace goes to the same school too. Wait, did I mention her daughter's name was Candace?
Yeah.
You mentioned it briefly. Internally, I questioned whether I had mentioned it unconsciously. But I had no recollection of saying her name. Still harboring doubts, I expressed my uneasy feeling and he tried to reassure me. I see. I'm not there with you, but it's probably just needless worry. After all, you didn't even know they were at the same school until now. Just be careful and you probably won't even meet them. Honestly, I wished he would come back and tell me that in person. But I knew it would be futile to say so. I had asked him to return in the past, but he never did. After that, we talked a little more and then ended the call. Were you on the phone with Dad? Yes, that's right. Did he say anything about Candace's mother? Caught off guard by his sudden question, I tilted my head. Not really, to which Scott simply replied, okay, and went into his room. I watched him go, then returned to my bedroom, still full of doubts and unease. Mom, are you okay? You look pale. I couldn't sleep well. I'm going to take the day off today. Is that really all? Are you sure you don't need to go to the hospital? Mother reassured me, I'm fine. Lately, her health hadn't been great. Scott seemed to have noticed too as he showed concern. Grandma, are you okay? Don't overdo it. Yet, all my mother would say was, I'm fine. Seeing her tired smile, I would soon regret not insisting she go to the hospital. Mom. Grandma has. The news came suddenly. Scott, having just returned from his club activities, found my mother collapsed at home. We called an ambulance immediately, but it was too late, she had passed away hours before. It's my fault. I knew something was wrong and I didn't do anything. It's not your fault, Mom. I knew too. Scott stayed by my side, comforting me in my grief. Paul was not there. Right after my mother died, I contacted him, but all he said was, understood, with a tone colder than I had ever heard. He didn't even show up for the funeral. This behavior only increased my distrust towards him. Mom, this is from Grandma. She said to give it to you if anything happened to her. When I was still furious at Paul, Scott handed me an envelope. After a hectic period, we had just finished the month memorial service. The doorbell rang, and I opened the door thinking it was a scheduled visitor, only to see. It's been a while. Paul? And, what's all this luggage? Paul, accompanied by numerous bags, ignored my questions and started bringing them inside. What's going on? Scott, who had been packing up some things, noticed the disturbance and came out. Casting a wary look at Paul. Your mother and I had an agreement. As thanks for letting me live here, she said this house would be mine after she passed. What? I was baffled by what Paul was saying. My mother leaving the house to Paul? I had never heard such a thing. So, I'm taking over this house. And I won't be living with you guys. Then, who are you planning to live with? That would be me, Gina. Turning towards the voice, there stood Emma, smiling broadly. It seemed she had walked in through the door Paul had left open while moving his stuff. Actually, we've been seeing each other, she said, looping her arm through Paul's. At this, I instinctively looked at Scott. My daughter, Candace, is Paul's child. At those words, it all clicked. Scott's eyes resembled Paul's. And if Candace also looked like them, it was entirely possible she was Paul's child too. I always wanted a daughter rather than a son. So, I'll be living here with my lovely wife and daughter. That's the plan. Paul grinned. Then, I'm taking old Hag's house. Get out. Paul laughed triumphantly. Behind him, his lover, Emma, also smirked. Had they been betraying us for years? If you understand, then pack your things and leave quickly. I looked towards Scott, worried about how he would react to seeing his father like this. Instead, Scott burst out laughing.
Haha.
They probably didn't expect him to laugh. Paul and Emma were stunned, their eyes wide. Meanwhile, I was carried away by Scott's laughter and burst out laughing myself. Scott, don't make me laugh. Sorry. As Scott and I spoke, Paul's expression turned angry, thinking we were mocking him. Are you making fun of me? Oh, have you gone crazy because you're suddenly being kicked out? Scott, Dad, don't you know? Then, Scott began to reveal a certain truth. Grandma knew you were cheating. She had it investigated. What? Indeed, my mother had been aware of Paul's infidelity. She had even hired a detective agency to look into it. The contents of the envelope Scott had given me on that day confirmed it. It clearly stated in there that you are Candace's father. And you said you were on business trips. But you were actually returning to an apartment where Emma and others were waiting, right? Paul, unable to meet my gaze, shifted his eyes away. Emma had met Paul at his father's company, where he had been assigned to train her. Taking advantage of her position close to the president's son, Emma had made her move as soon as she learned he was my husband, attempting to take him from me. But due to various circumstances, Paul and I cannot separate. So, he's been supporting her as a mistress, providing for her living and child expenses. Now it was Emma's turn to look away, clearly embarrassed by her actions. I couldn't help but be amazed at her audacity to go after a married man. Moreover, her child Candace is just a year younger than Scott. Emma had become pregnant with Candace soon after meeting Paul. You certainly didn't waste any time. At my words, Emma's face turned red, though she remained silent, acknowledging the truth. I think I'm stupid for not noticing. It's not your fault. No one expects their life to turn into a drama like this. Scott's comforting words contrasted with Paul, who frantically searched for excuses. I never imagined that every holiday, he was actually with his mistress. Considering he was hardly ever at home, he must have been with Emma even on weekdays. Paul was likely spending his time at Emma's place. Not with us, enjoying a double life while deceiving us. The only reason you came home for our birthdays was to score points with us. And you only came to the sports day and other events because Candace was there, right? It wasn't for me, it was to see her perform. Facing our cold stares, both Paul and Emma struggled for words. Learning the truth felt like a betrayal that overshadowed even the grief of losing my mother. And I was disgusted with myself for not realizing sooner. After all the betrayal, you expect us to just hand over this house filled with memories? Are you joking? Give me a break with your disrespect. Shut up. It's your fault. You gave birth to a son who isn't even cute. And you earn more than I do, the next president. Paul lashed out in anger when I confronted him. As I glared back, he fell silent. This house is mine. It's only natural that I, a direct descendant of my mother, inherit it, and it's written in the will. What will? She collapsed suddenly, right? She had been feeling ill before that. We had a lawyer come just in case to prepare a will. The will stated that all her property would go only to me and Scott, explicitly excluding Paul. It even says, all agreements with the betrayer are to be annulled. Maybe she meant this house. That can't be. By the way, I've already sold the house. As I informed him, Paul froze in shock. Staying in this house, filled with memories of my mother, would have been too painful. Scott and I decided to move into a condominium near his school. We were both packing our things today. After meeting with the visitor, we planned to move to the condo with our belongings. Sold it to whom? To me. The voice came from behind them. As they turned around in shock, there stood my father-in-law, his face etched with anger. You've brought shame upon me. At his words, Paul turned pale. Emma, not expecting her employer and company president to appear, let out a small scream and clung to Paul. Someone like you will be expelled from both this house and the company. What? Why? I'm the successor. Paul tried to confront his father-in-law, shaking off Emma. In response, my father-in-law calmly replies with an angry expression. Who said you were the successor? Dad wanted me to take over the company. Indeed, I said I wanted your son Scott to take over, not you. It appeared the father-in-law intended for Scott, not Paul, to inherit the company. But somehow the message got misconstrued over time. How can I entrust the company to someone who skips work just because he's the president's son? It seems that he was skipping work because he didn't go home on business trips and holidays. And in fact, he was skipping work because he was the next president. However, it seems that he was pushing his work on weak-minded subordinates and threatening to fire them if they broke up. As a result, it was difficult to discover that he was slacking off. Because of you, I've had to apologize everywhere. It seems that the subordinate quit the other day and joined a different company. And he reported it to my father-in-law via the company. He apologized earlier and said that he took steps to restore trust. Because the president-elect had done the same. After the apology visit, I came to this house. Had I known, I would have declared Scott as my successor from the start. Please spare me that. I plan to join my mother's company, not Granddad's. At his words, Scott firmly stated his intent. In fact, I am also the president. Originally, my father's family has run the company for generations. After my grandfather died, my father took over, and after my father died suddenly in a car accident, my mother took over. From there, I took over. What? Gina is a president? Oh, didn't you know? It appears that Paul never talked about me to her. Originally, Paul and I met through a matchmaking arrangement. Our fathers, both company presidents, introduced us thinking it would be a good match. Moreover, my company and my father-in-law's company are engaged in transactions worth several millions. I wonder what would happen if I said I'm going to stop these transactions because of this incident. If the contract were to be terminated, my father-in-law's company would face a crisis. To prevent this, my father-in-law decided to buy this house immediately. And came here himself on moving day to persuade me. You are a harm to me in both personal and business matters. And I will not acknowledge such a woman as my daughter-in-law. That's not fair. Listen to my side too. Amidst an enraged father-in-law and a pleading Paul, there was a flustered Emma. Leaving them behind, Scott and I grabbed our bags and got into the car. In the end, Granddad is also acting out of self-preservation, isn't he? Absolutely. I want to cut ties with them as soon as possible. Feeling suddenly exhausted, we quickly moved to the apartment. So, what are we going to do about the contract with Granddad? Of course, I plan to terminate it. I had been looking for an opportunity to break off the transactions with my father-in-law's company for some time. Like Paul, my father-in-law was self-centered, disregarding our circumstances and demanding. It's my daughter-in-law's company, so they should make the deals I want. And force deals that were profitable only for his company. During my mother's time, the contracts were still reasonable because she owed a lot to my father-in-law's father, the previous president. However, it seemed he got carried away because the young inheritor was his daughter-in-law. Every time we meet, he tells me he wants me to take over the company. But naturally, I want to work for a company that I respect, not for someone I can't. Hearing Scott mutter this made me happy. The ones who have always seen me for who I am were Scott and my mother. For them, I decided to start taking action. I then filed for damages against the two. I truly love you. Paul clung to me saying this, but I completely ignored him. He tried to reach out to Scott as well, but because he had never faced us properly before, he couldn't even have a proper conversation. Ultimately, Scott said, "There's nothing to talk about with Dad. It's boring to be with him." Which left Paul devastated. As a result, both he and Emma were expelled from the company and the house by my father-in-law, saddled with debts and forced to pay damages. What concerned me was Candace's existence. Despite being born to such unreasonable parents, she grew up to be a sensible and mild-mannered girl. I felt sorry that she was caught up in this mess. Candace will be fine. I asked my best friend about her. It turns out that Candace was practically raised by her grandmother. Although Paul doted on her because she was his daughter, it was only superficial. He only cared for her when it suited him. And Emma, she treated Candace like a doll to ensure Paul would not leave her. As a result, Candace found her place with Scott's best friend and her grandmother. Grandma apparently knew about Candace because of Dad. She often got stuck taking care of her. My mother-in-law was a model of old femininity, always following her husband's lead and never opposing men. Thus, she was conveniently used. Raised by such a my mother-in-law, it's no wonder Candace turned out to be a good girl. And this time, Grandma was also angry. She said she couldn't leave Candace with Dad and Granddad. So she submitted a divorce notice and left with Candace. It seems Candace was like a daughter to her grandmother. So, she took action to protect her. Hearing this, I hesitated for a moment but then reached out to the grandmother. "I'm truly sorry my son has caused trouble. I wonder if my husband also caused problems at work." My mother-in-law's voice was kind, not calculated like Paul's, but genuinely compassionate. "No. Where are you and Candace now?" "For now, we're staying at a hotel." "If that's the case." After consulting with Scott, I invited my mother-in-law and Candace to our apartment. Our chosen apartment has high security, so I doubted Paul and his associates would come around. "Would you both like to live in this apartment?" I spoke to the management company, and there's another room available. I'll pay the rent for the time being. I am a president after all, so I can afford 2 rooms. "That's too kind. Consider it in advance on future payments." At my words, Candace looked up at me, and I returned her smile. "If I terminate the contract with my father-in-law's company, it will likely plunge into bankruptcy immediately. Originally, my father-in-law's company existed only because of its connection with mine. Many companies had contracts with the previous generation, but they all moved away due to my father-in-law's overbearing nature. Now, only companies like my mother's, which felt indebted to the previous president, remained. In such a situation, if I pulled out, other companies would likely sever their contracts one after another. If that happens, I plan to buy out that company. Is that so? Please do as you wish, Gina. Candace, are you interested in management? Candace looked surprised at my question. Scott had told me that she wanted to join her grandfather's company. But because of her gender, her grandfather would never consider her as a successor. If you study management at university, could you manage a subsidiary as its president in my stead? You can repay the rent and tuition gradually. Thank you so much. Tears welled up in Candace's eyes as she thanked deeply. Soon after, I successfully acquired my father-in-law's company. It seems the loyal subordinate who had been working under my father-in-law is now in charge of the company, and my father-in-law himself has been dismissed. I've made sure the subordinate knows about Candace's situation. I will definitely meet Gina's expectations. With these words, Candace, along with her boyfriend who is also Scott's best friend, has been diligently studying. Scott, too, finds motivation from them, and all three are often seen studying hard together. If Gina and my grandchild are working hard, I must do the same. While watching the study group with me, my mother-in-law murmured this. I tilted my head, not quite understanding her words at first. What? That house. Yes. I received it as part of the property settlement. It turns out the house that my father-in-law bought was awarded to my mother-in-law in the division of assets. Now, we can return to that house whenever we wish. While things are moving in a positive direction for us, Paul and Emma seem to be facing a series of unfortunate events. They blame each other for their current predicament. And it has also come to light that both were involved with multiple partners, leading to a major argument, yet they ended up marrying each other. Some of their affairs were with married individuals, which has led them to incur even more debt. I briefly mentioned this to Scott, but all he said was, "Oh well." Some time later. I am truly sorry. Please forgive me. The two came to me, offering apologies. Apparently, my mother has been appearing in their dreams, scolding them. How dare you hurt my precious daughter? Tormented by these nightly accusations, they've lost the will to fight each other. Well, my mother really cherished me. Maybe if you keep bothering us, you might get cursed, you know? This made them go pale, and they fled in tears. I couldn't help but laugh as I watched them leave. I can't keep worrying my mother forever. I muttered this to myself and decided to work even harder. Eventually, the two rejoined my father-in-law. Apparently, my father-in-law, who lacks the ability to live independently without my mother-in-law, reluctantly lives with them. I hope they just collapse together. Years later, Scott and Candace have grown up impressively. Scott is now my right hand in my business. And Candace is preparing to take over as the president of a subsidiary. Mom, there's someone I want you to meet.
Ah.
You mean your secretary? Both have found partners they can trust, both personally and professionally. Inspired by Candace, who was recently proposed to by her best friend, Scott also decided to propose to his significant other. Though they are siblings made complex by circumstance, it seems they have developed a mutually inspiring relationship. I still have much to do. Motivated by my children, I continue to dedicate myself to work. I look forward to the day when Scott is completely independent, and I can live a more relaxed life. Until then, I remain focused on running the company.